The first time I saw the cabins, I almost laughed. They stood there in neat little rows, like soldiers lined up for inspection, each one with a fresh coat of paint, shiny new windows, and porches facing the lake I'd grown you looking at. It was almost beautiful, almost, because I knew what it took for them to be there. I knew how my lakefront ended up in someone else's hands. And I knew something they didn't. Let me back up. I owned more than just a patch of land. I owned a piece of water, a piece of history. My grandfather built the dam decades ago with his own crew. That dam wasn't just concrete and steel. It was the heart of the lake. Without it, the lake didn't exist. Without it, every drop of water in front of those shiny cabins would disappear. But a few months ago, the HOA decided they wanted to maximize the community's potential. That's a fancy way of saying they wanted to take the quiet, peaceful lakefront and turn it into a money-making vacation hotspot. They claimed parts of the shoreline were common property. They said they had the legal right to develop. They didn't ask me. They didn't negotiate. They sent me a letter telling me they were moving forward. At first, I didn't fight it. Why? Because I wanted to see just how far they'd go. They were confident, too confident. They thought I was just another property owner who'd complain, maybe hire a lawyer, and lose. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Construction started quickly. I watched as the trucks rolled in, carrying wood, cement, and roofing materials. I heard the hammers, the saws, the music blasting from job site radios. In a matter of weeks, the skeletons of cabins began to rise. Every time I passed by, there were more walls, more porches, more signs of their vision coming to life. They even put up a big sign near the road. Lakeside cabins, opening soon. They made it sound so perfect. I could almost hear the laughter of tourists, the splash of canoes in the water, the sizzle of grills on summer nights. But underneath all that charm was arrogance. They didn't just think they owned the lake, they believed they controlled it. What they didn't know, and what I kept to myself, was that the lake didn't belong to them. Sure, they had cabins by the water, but the water itself? That was held back by my dam. Without that dam, their investment was nothing but empty land with a muddy ditch running through it. And that dam was not, and never had been, part of the HOA's property. You'd think someone in their leadership would have checked that. You'd think a lawyer, a surveyor, anybody, would have looked into the deed records. But no, they were too busy patting themselves on the back for developing under budget. While they worked, I stayed quiet. Neighbors kept asking if I was angry. I just smiled and told them I was curious to see the final product. Truth was, I was keeping track. Every cabin, every dock they added, every penny they spent. I was patient because I knew the day would come when patience would pay off. And then came the moment that made me certain they'd crossed the line. One morning, I got a letter from the HOA's lawyer. It claimed they had full authority over the lake and all related structures. They wanted access to the dam for safety inspections. That's when I realized they truly had no idea. They weren't just taking my lakefront. They were trying to take the dam too. I walked down to the dam that evening, stood on the concrete edge, and looked out over the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the orange streaks of sunset. From here, I could see the cabins, tiny shapes along the shoreline. I thought about how quickly the scene could change. One turn of a valve, one shift in the gates, and all that calm water would begin to move. I didn't rush. This wasn't a decision to make in anger. This was about control, about reminding people that power doesn't always sit where they think it does. They believed their money, their board meetings, and their bylaws made them untouchable. But I knew something they didn't. When you own the dam, you own the lake. And as they kept building day after day, they were stacking their future on top of a foundation they didn't own, one that I could change at any moment. The next few weeks were like watching a storm roll in. You can see the dark clouds forming on the horizon, you can feel the air change, but the people around you? They're still out having picnics, smiling, thinking everything is fine. That's exactly how the HOA looked to me, completely unaware of what was about to hit them. Every morning, I'd pass by the construction site on my way into town. They had doubled their workforce. Trucks were stacked up along the road, workers carrying beams on their shoulders, foremen barking orders like they were building an empire. I heard them talking about Phase 2 and premium rates for the waterfront units. They spoke like the lake was theirs by birthright. One afternoon, I stopped by the small cafe in town. It's the kind of place where you can't order a coffee without hearing 5 different conversations at once. Sure enough, the talk of the day was the cabins. People were saying how beautiful they'd be, how this would bring in tourists, boost the local economy. Some even said it would raise property values. I just sipped my coffee and listened. Nobody asked me what I thought, and I didn't offer. The truth was, I wasn't just watching them build cabins. I was watching them build a trap for themselves. Every nail they drove in, every window they installed, was another piece of leverage in my hands. I had the one thing they couldn't buy, couldn't replace, and couldn't build from scratch. Then came the fundraiser. The HOA decided to hold a big community celebration to raise more money for lake improvements. The flyer said they were going to use the funds to enhance access to the water. That one made me laugh. Access to the water? They were acting like the water was a fixed thing, like it would always be right there waiting for them. I went to the event, not to participate, but to observe. They set up tents, live music, food trucks, the works. People were laughing, kids were running around with balloons, and the HOA board members were walking from group to group, shaking hands like politicians. They didn't notice me standing near the edge of the crowd, leaning against a fence. That's when I overheard one of the board members bragging to a couple of guests. "We've got full control of this lake now. The cabins are just the start. Next year, maybe we'll add a marina. Imagine the revenue." His words weren't just arrogance, they were proof. Proof that they had no clue about the dam's ownership. A few days later, I got another letter. This one wasn't from their lawyer. It was from the HOA president herself. She requested that I sign over an easement for the dam, in the interest of community safety and cooperation. The tone was polite, but underneath it was a hint of pressure. I could practically hear her saying, "If you don't, we'll make trouble for you." I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I went down to the dam again, this time with a notepad. I checked the gates, the spillway, the flow. I wrote down everything: dates, water levels, maintenance notes. If I was going to make a move, I wanted my facts straight. Meanwhile, the cabins were nearly finished. Fresh landscaping lined the walkways. They'd built small docks stretching into the water, and they even had rental canoes tied up, ready for use. From a distance, it looked like a vacation paradise. Up close, it looked like a disaster waiting to happen. I could tell some of the workers were getting curious about me. A couple of them asked if I was part of the HOA. I just said, "No, but I know the lake pretty well." That seemed to satisfy them, for now. The real turning point came one morning when I was down by the shoreline, checking the water level. One of the board members drove by and slowed his car. He rolled down his window and said, "Hope you're enjoying the improvements. You'll thank us one day." He smiled, waved, and drove off. I watched his car disappear, then turned my eyes back to the lake. The sun was just coming up, the light hitting the surface like gold. It was beautiful, but all I could think about was how quickly that gold could turn to cracked mud if I chose to make it happen. And the best part, they still didn't have the slightest idea that choice was mine alone. A few days later, I started noticing little signs that the HOA was getting bolder. Not just confident bolder. They weren't satisfied with building cabins and docks anymore. Now they were talking about lakefront regulations, as if they had the authority to tell every property owner how to use their slice of shoreline. The first hint came in the form of a neatly folded notice left in my mailbox. No stamp, no envelope, just a single sheet of paper with the HOA logo at the top. It read, *, effective immediately. All lakefront properties must comply with HOA landscaping guidelines to maintain visual harmony for our new development. *. I read it twice, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Visual harmony? My lakefront wasn't part of their new development. And yet, here they were, telling me what kind of plants I could grow on land they didn't own. I set the paper down on my kitchen counter, and for a moment, I just stared at it. It wasn't anger that I felt, it was amusement. They were walking deeper into the woods without realizing they were lost. By the end of the week, they'd upped the ante. I heard from a neighbor that the board was drafting rules for lake use. They wanted to set hours for boating, limit fishing to certain zones, and require permits for events on the water. Permits. For a lake that literally wouldn't exist without my dam. So I did what I always do when people start to underestimate me. I started keeping closer watch. I visited the dam every evening, taking notes, checking for any signs of wear, and making sure the gates were in perfect working order. The more they assumed control, the more I was reminded of the quiet truth. They had nothing without me. One afternoon, I was sitting on a bench overlooking the lake when I saw 2 HOA board members walking the shore with a clipboard. They stopped by each cabin, scribbling notes, pointing at the docks. When they reached my side of the lake, they didn't even look in my direction. I wasn't part of their world, or so they thought. That evening, my phone buzzed with an email. It was from the HOA's community liaison, inviting me to a special meeting. The subject line read, *discussion on future lake expansion. *expansion. That word alone told me they were getting reckless. They weren't just planning to use what they'd built, they wanted more. I didn't reply to the email, but I did show up to the meeting. I sat quietly at the back of the room while they laid out their big plans. Slideshows, budget forecasts, even mock-up drawings of a new marina and a boardwalk. They spoke about how our lake was going to become a premier destination. They spoke with pride, with excitement, and with a total lack of awareness that their entire dream rested on ground they didn't control. At one point, the HOA president looked straight at me and said, "We're counting on the cooperation of every property owner to make this vision a reality." I smiled and nodded, but inside I was thinking, cooperation? You're going to need a lot more than that, After the meeting, a couple of members came over to chat. They asked if I'd consider donating a portion of my shoreline for public access. One of them even said it would be a generous legacy for the community. I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes either. I just told them I'd think about it. In reality, I wasn't thinking about giving them anything. I was thinking about how far they were willing to push before they realized the foundation of their empire was made of water. Water I could take away. As the weeks went on, their plans moved forward. Contractors were booked for the marina. The cabins were being advertised online, with glossy photos and catchy taglines. Reservations were already being taken for next summer. And all the while, I kept my mouth shut, my dam gates locked, and my patience intact. Because I knew the longer they built up their dream, the harder it would fall when the truth finally came rushing in. It was a warm Saturday morning when I finally saw just how far they were willing to go. I had driven down to the lake to check the water level. But before I could even get out of my truck, I noticed a couple of men in bright orange vests standing at the base of the dam. They weren't from my maintenance crew. I didn't recognize their faces. I parked and walked over, my boots crunching against the gravel. One of them looked up from a clipboard and said, "Morning. We're here for the HOA inspection." Just like that. No introduction, no permission, just a casual statement, as if they had any right to be there. "Inspection?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Yeah," he said, flipping through his notes. "The board wants to make sure the dam is safe. Liability stuff, you know?" I almost laughed. Liability stuff. These guys were standing on my property, poking around my dam, acting like they were doing me a favor. I told them they needed to leave immediately. At first, they hesitated, probably thinking I was bluffing. But when I made it clear they were trespassing, they packed up and left, mumbling something about miscommunication. That little stunt told me everything I needed to know. They weren't just dreaming about control anymore. They were actively trying to take it. And if they were bold enough to send inspectors onto my dam without my consent, I had no doubt they were making bigger moves behind the scenes. Sure enough, 3 days later, a certified letter arrived. It was a formal request for transfer of ownership for the dam. They framed it as a gesture of goodwill for the benefit of the community. In exchange, they'd offer me lifetime access to the lake. Lifetime access to my own water. I set the letter down and just stared at it for a moment, shaking my head. That night, I walked out onto the dam under the moonlight. The air was still, the water calm. I could hear crickets in the distance, and somewhere across the lake, faint music from one of the new cabins. Everything looked so peaceful on the surface, but I knew what was brewing. The HOA thought they were closing in on their prize. They didn't realize they were walking straight into the shadow of something they couldn't control. From that point on, I decided to stop being invisible. Not loud, not confrontational, just present. I started showing up at every public HOA meeting. I didn't speak much, but I made sure they saw me there, sitting in the back with my arms crossed, listening to every word. At the same time, I doubled my own preparations. I had the dam inspected by my people, documented every detail, and made sure every maintenance log was up to date. If I ever needed to prove that I was the sole owner and caretaker, the evidence would be airtight. The cabins were now fully furnished. I'd seen moving trucks bringing in beds, sofas, even flat-screen TVs. The landscaping crews were planting flowers along the walkways, and the docks had been freshly painted. Their online ads were ramping up. Book your summer escape now, with photos of shimmering water and perfect sunsets. But in those photos, I could see something they probably didn't notice. In the background of every shot, there was the dam. My dam. Solid and silent, holding back the very thing that made their cabins worth a dime. Then came the moment that made me realize the clock was ticking. I was in the hardware store picking up supplies when I overheard two men talking near the paint aisle. One of them mentioned that the HOA was planning to upgrade the dam. My dam. I stepped around the corner, and sure enough, they were wearing shirts with the HOA's logo. That's when it hit me. They were done playing polite. They were preparing to act as if the dam was already theirs. And that meant the time for patience was coming to an end. The more they built, the more they invested, the deeper they dug themselves into a hole they didn't even know existed. And all I had to do was wait for the perfect moment to show them just how deep that hole really went. The perfect moment came closer than I expected. It started with a sudden knock on my door early one morning. I opened it to find the HOA president herself, standing there with a too-wide smile and a folder tucked under her arm. Behind her were two men in suits, each holding a clipboard. "Good morning," she said in a tone so sugary it almost hurt my teeth. "We're here to discuss the future of the lake and how we can all work together for the benefit of the community." I didn't invite them in. We stood on the porch, the morning air still cool, the sun just beginning to creep over the treetops. She launched into her pitch, flipping open the folder to reveal glossy renderings of an expanded marina, a lakeside cafe, and a row of luxury cabins that would dwarf the ones they'd already built. Her voice was confident, polished, like she'd practiced the speech in front of a mirror. She talked about partnership and shared resources. Then she slid a single-page document toward me. "We just need your signature to get things moving." I glanced at the paper. It was a formal transfer of rights to the dam. Not a lease, not a temporary agreement, permanent. Once signed, they'd own it outright. In exchange, they were offering me a lump sum that was laughable compared to what the dam and the lake were actually worth. I handed the paper back to her without a word. The smile on her face tightened. "You understand," she said, her voice losing a bit of its shine. "This project benefits everyone. Refusing to cooperate could create challenges for the community." I leaned on the doorframe and looked her straight in the eye. "I understand perfectly," I said. Then I shut the door. That was the last friendly visit. After that, the HOA stopped pretending. The next week, I got letters accusing me of hindering community development. They hinted at legal action, claiming the dam was a shared resource under HOA bylaws. Of course, those bylaws had nothing to do with my property, but it was clear they were hoping intimidation would work where charm had failed. I didn't respond to any of it. Instead, I spent my days quietly making sure everything on my end was in perfect order. I had the dam gates serviced, replaced a few worn parts, and even had a professional surveyor remap the property lines to confirm, again, that the dam sat entirely on my land. Meanwhile, their preparations for the grand opening of the cabins were in full swing. Trucks delivered furniture, kayaks, and paddleboards. A brand new sign went up near the entrance: Lakeside Retreat, opening Memorial Day weekend. They even set up an online countdown clock, like they were launching a major event. From my porch, I could see the cabins at night, their windows glowing softly in the dark. I could hear the workers testing sound systems, smell the fresh-cut wood from new decks being built. They were so close to pulling it off, so sure the lake would be there to make their dream real. And that's when I noticed something that made me pause. The water level had been dropping, just slightly, but enough for me to see a faint line along the shoreline where the grass had started to dry. It wasn't from the dam, it was from the lack of rain. A dry spell had been hanging over us for weeks, and while it hadn't caused any real problems yet, it reminded me of just how delicate this whole setup was. The HOA didn't seem to notice. Or maybe they noticed but assumed it didn't matter. Either way, they were still planning big. Flyers were being mailed out to surrounding towns, advertising lakefront fun for the whole family. Local businesses were getting involved, offering package deals for tourists. The whole county was buzzing about the grand opening. But every time I looked at that waterline, I thought about how easy it would be to lower it just a little more. How quickly their lakefront could turn into mudfront. How the cabins, the docks, the marina, all of it, depended on something they didn't control. And the best part? The more they promoted their grand opening, the more public their humiliation would be when the truth finally came out. 2 weeks before their big opening, I got the call that told me they were out of time. A friend in town who keeps his ear to the ground told me the HOA had secured a loan, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to fund the final phase of their project. The cabins were just the start. They were already planning a second wave of construction. More docks, more cabins, and even a small event center for weddings. That meant they'd sunk everything into this lake. Every dime, every hour, every plan depended on one thing: that the water stayed exactly where it was. I took a drive down to the dam that evening, just before sunset. The air was still and heavy, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper. The lake lay stretched out in front of me, smooth as glass, the cabins reflecting perfectly in the water. They looked almost magical in that fading light. And yet, I couldn't help but see them as fragile things, structures balanced on an illusion. As I walked the length of the dam, I could hear the faint hum of their preparations across the water. Music testing from speakers. Voices calling back and forth. Somewhere a hammer hitting wood. It was all so busy, so alive. The gates of the dam were solid beneath my hands. Cool metal, well-oiled, ready to move if I decided it was time. I'd maintained them for years, knowing that one day, ownership might matter more than anyone could imagine. And here we were. That day was close. The next morning, I went into town for supplies, and everywhere I turned, people were talking about the grand opening. At the hardware store, two men debated whether the cabins would be booked out for the whole summer. At the diner, a waitress said she'd already had tourists asking for directions. Even the local paper had a front-page story about how Lakeside Retreat was going to transform the community. Transform the community. That was their favorite phrase. But I knew what they really meant: transform it into a business, into a money-making machine. And they were building it all on something they didn't own. That afternoon, the HOA made their boldest move yet. I got another letter. This one certified, with legal language so thick it might as well have been written in a foreign language. Buried in the middle was the key. They were notifying me that they would be assuming management of all lake-related infrastructure, effective immediately. No court order. No agreement. Just a declaration, as if they could take control simply by saying the words. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and set it on my desk. Then I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. We'd been waiting for this. We didn't talk long, but by the time I hung up, I knew exactly what my next steps were. The following days felt strange. I went about my normal routine, checking the dam, doing small repairs, keeping logs, but underneath it all, there was a steady hum of anticipation. I could feel the moment coming closer, like the slow build before a storm breaks. On the Friday before their opening weekend, I walked down to the shoreline early in the morning. Mist hung over the lake, curling in thin ribbons above the water. The cabins stood quiet, their porches empty, their lights still off. It was peaceful in a way I knew wouldn't last. By the next day, this place would be full of strangers, tourists taking photos, kids splashing in the shallows, boats pushing out into the water. I crouched down, scooped a handful of lake water, and let it slip through my fingers. Cold, smooth, gone in seconds. It made me think about how quickly things can change. One shift in the gates, one decision, and all that peace could turn into chaos. The HOA thought they had everything locked down. They thought the lake was theirs to command. But what they didn't understand was that the lake didn't care about their deadlines, their guests, or their business plans. The lake existed because of the dam. And the dam existed because of me. As I stood there, the first rays of sunlight breaking over the trees, I felt it. This was more than just property. This was leverage. This was the quiet kind of power that doesn't shout or rush. It waits. And when it moves, it changes everything. Saturday morning came with the sound of engines. Not the small outboard motors I was used to hearing, but the heavy rumble of delivery trucks and SUVs hauling trailers. By 7 a.m., the once quiet road to the cabins was a steady stream of vehicles. Banners fluttered in the breeze. The smell of grilling meat drifted across the water. Music thumped faintly, punctuated by the occasional loud laugh or shout. From my porch, I could see the activity spilling onto the docks. Workers in matching polo shirts were hauling boxes, arranging tables, and setting up kayaks for rental. The HOA board members, dressed in their official vests, strutted around like they owned the entire horizon. But every time my eyes moved from their busy little empire to the dam, I felt the same calm, steady certainty. They were playing on borrowed time. By mid-morning, the first guests arrived in droves. Families in swimsuits, couples in matching sunglasses, even a few people dragging coolers so large they looked like they were preparing for a month-long stay. The laughter grew louder. Boat motors roared to life. Kids splashed in the shallows while parents sipped drinks under bright umbrellas. They had no idea the water under their paddleboards, the lake holding up their view, was one turn of a valve away from changing everything. I took a walk toward the dam, keeping to the tree line so I wouldn't be noticed. From that vantage point, I could see it all. The shiny cabins with their new railings. The neatly arranged rental kayaks bobbing gently. The glitter of sunlight off the lake's surface. And then, the thing that made me stop in my tracks, right near the waterline, they'd set up a temporary stage. Someone was adjusting microphones while a small crowd gathered, waiting for what I guessed would be a grand opening speech. I didn't even have to strain to imagine what they'd say. A lot of self-congratulation, some vague promises about community enrichment, and maybe a cheer or two for how far they'd come. But the truth? They hadn't come far at all. They'd just built a dream on top of someone else's foundation. Around noon, the speeches began. I could hear the amplified voices even from across the water. The HOA president, who'd signed most of the threatening letters I'd received, was up there smiling wide, holding a wireless mic like he was the star of some local festival. He talked about unlocking the potential of this lake and bringing new life to the area. The crowd clapped and cheered, soaking up the performance. I leaned against the dam's railing and let their words drift toward me. Every sentence sounded like an unintentional reminder of just how deeply they relied on something they didn't control. After the speeches, the music kicked in again, louder this time. The afternoon sun was high, sparkling across the lake like it had been polished. Boats pulled away from the dock in a steady line, carving white trails through the blue water. Kids squealed with joy. From the outside, it looked perfect, picture postcard perfect. But I knew the one detail that could tear that picture in half. I walked the dam slowly, my fingers brushing against the cool steel of the wheel. I'd tested it only a week before. It turned smooth, no resistance. All it would take was a decision. Not even a big one, just a quiet motion, the kind nobody on the other side of the lake would notice until it was already happening. The air smelled like barbecue and sunscreen, but beneath it, I caught the faint scent of wet concrete rising from the spillway. That scent always made me think of the power here. Not the kind that comes with titles or boards or bank loans, but the kind that comes from controlling the one thing everything else depends on. Late in the afternoon, the party reached its peak. Music blaring, boats zipping back and forth, the cabins glowing golden in the sun. Everyone thought they were celebrating the start of something unstoppable. And that's when I smiled, because I knew they were really celebrating the last perfect day they'd ever have on this lake. The sun began to dip, throwing long shadows over the cabins. The golden glow made the water look like molten metal, calm and smooth, hiding every secret underneath. On the far side, the stage lights were starting to flicker on. I could hear a live band tuning their guitars, the sound bouncing faintly across the lake. I stayed near the dam, leaning against the railing like I had all the time in the world. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A friend from town had texted. "Looks like they're throwing a huge party out there. You going?" I just typed back, "Not exactly," and slipped the phone away. From here, I could see everything. Boats still crisscrossing the lake, their wakes rippling toward the shore. Kids still splashing in the shallows. The smell of smoked ribs and grilled burgers floated over the water, mixing with the sound of laughter. It looked like the sort of evening you'd put on a postcard, one they'd probably try to use in their next HOA newsletter. But all I could think about was how quickly perfection turns fragile. The dam's control wheel was cool under my hand. I didn't turn it, not yet. This wasn't about rage. It wasn't about smashing their fun just for the sake of it. It was about timing. If you act too soon, it's a tantrum. If you wait until the right moment, it's a lesson they'll never forget. I could picture the scene in my head. A sudden drop in the waterline, boats scraping against the mud, docks left hanging in the air. I'd seen it happen once years ago during a maintenance flush, and even back then, with no one's money or pride on the line, the reaction had been chaos. Now, it would be 10 times worse. A cheer erupted from the other side. The band had started playing, something upbeat, loud enough to make people clap along. The HOA board members were all front and center, drinks in hand, grinning like they'd built the lake with their bare hands. They were taking credit for every drop of water they didn't even own. And that's when it hit me. They weren't just using the lake. They were counting on it. The cabins, the rentals, the resort branding. None of it worked without this water. Without the view. Without the boats. Without the steady, full shoreline that made people believe they were in some private paradise. It was the perfect kind of dependence. The kind you could pull out from under someone without touching anything they physically built. I paced slowly, feeling the low hum of the dam beneath my boots. The structure had been here for decades, solid and unshakable. I knew every bolt, every weld, every inch of concrete. My grandfather had worked on it. My father had maintained it. And now I was the one with the key, literally. The party noise carried across the water. Bits of conversation floated my way. Best weekend ever. We should book another week. Can't believe the view. They were already making plans for a future that wasn't guaranteed past tonight. I thought about how smug the board had been when they announced their plans months ago. How they'd waved off my concerns. How they'd sent me letters warning me not to interfere with community development. The same people now drinking under my sunset were the ones who had assumed I was powerless. I checked my watch. The moment was close. The lake shimmered, perfectly still except for the occasional ripple from a boat. The cabins glowed warm and inviting, their windows catching the last light of day. The music swelled, the crowd cheered again, and I could almost feel the exact second the mood reached its highest point. And standing there, with one hand on the wheel, I knew exactly how quickly I could change everything they thought they had.